Let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Getting to Systems Change, Canada's Report on Poverty. My name is Natasha Pei. I'm a manager of cities for Tamarack's Communities Ending Poverty. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. And as settlers, it's important to recognize the contributions and historic importance of the Indigenous people and reaffirm our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm calling in from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, also known as Gatineau. I invite each of you to introduce yourself in the chat box as well, including the traditional land that you are calling in from. And now on to introducing our panel. So first, we have a guest moderator here with us today, Lee. Lee is a policy and research specialist for Vibrant Communities Calgary. She has provided leadership and support to several groups advancing the Enough for All poverty reduction strategy in Calgary, such as the Indigenous Gathering Place, Basic Income Calgary, Alberta Living Wage Network, and the Calgary Social Policy Collaborative. Lee has worked as a social worker since 2006 and has a Bachelor and Master of Social Work from the University of Calgary. We also see that you have here with us today, Scott. Scott is the chairperson of the National Advisory Council on Poverty. Prior to this position, he spent nearly 20 years with the government of New Brunswick, working on poverty reduction through the Department of Social Development and the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation. Scott is passionate about asset-based community development, storytelling, literacy, community transportation, and social enterprise. We also have Sylvie with us. Sylvie is a member of the National Advisory Council on Poverty as well, and is a leader in children's issues. From the start of her career with Quebec's first Garderie Populaire, which was a precursor to the publicly subsidized daycare centers, in Saint-Henri as the executive director of the Carrefour Jeunesse Emploi Vaudreuil-Soulanges. She has accumulated more than 35 years of work in the community where children and young adults have been her primary concern. She feels very strongly about young people reaching and fulfilling their potential, accessing services, and improving their quality of life. And finally, we have Cheryl. Cheryl is also a member of the National Advisory Council on Poverty and executive director of the Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society. She oversees 18 different programs and services, helping urban Aboriginal people live in two worlds at once. In the city of Edmonton, with its particular laws and norms, and the Aboriginal world of ceremonies and beliefs that has existed for millennia. Cheryl also serves on the End Poverty Edmonton Roundtable and Stewardship Roundtable, and believes that ending poverty requires a diversity of voices to ensure better systems and communities for us all. So welcome, Lee, Cheryl, Scott, Sylvie. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. And Lee, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Natasha. And okay, let's get started. So this is the first report that really gives us a glimpse into how the pandemic has impacted poverty. So what is the data indicating? What are people saying about poverty in the engagement sessions? And Scott, could you briefly just summarize the recommendations for us?
Went out in the winter, spring of 2021. We did about 22 engagement sessions, mostly thematic based, but also we had other provincial and territorial sessions. Our recommendations kind of broke down into 5 categories. One was Indigenous prosperity, equity, dignity, prevention, and income. So those are the big lines around the recommendations. The data was a big piece that we went to find the data. A lot of the groups that we had were the most made marginal, where it wasn't available. So one of our key recommendations was around really beefing up the data gathering and the more inclusive questions and response options.
Awesome, thanks, Scott. We're going to get into data a little bit later too as well. But I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl now because I want to talk about the Council Report's first recommendation, implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the recommendations in the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we know those recommendations are long overdue, so I think it's pretty obvious why they were the first. But could you briefly touch on those recommendations, and where do you think we need to start?
I think every conversation we had in our engagement sessions last year touched on the inequities around Indigenous people interacting with certain systems, being overrepresented in deficit-based systems and underrepresented in strength-based systems. So the TRC calls to action, the very first, I think it was 5 recommendations in the calls to action under the TRC report are around child welfare. So it's starting very early and making sure that our current child welfare system is paying attention to 5 very key areas when it comes to how they're serving Indigenous families across the nation. The act respecting, what is it called? It's a long name, respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth and families, commonly known as Bill C-92. I've made an affirmation to call it by its name because it is in fact law right now, has been law for, I think, just over a year now. And it is starting to be implemented across the land. And it's in various stages, depending on which region you're in. So, and I think the pandemic really slowed down the implementation, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think we need to be thoughtful about how we implement this, this act. And because of the way things slowed down during the pandemic, I think it gave people time to reflect on how to implement this in the most effective way, region by region. The other thing that I find promising is that the government made a recent announcement of $40 billion. You know, 20 billion of it is going to be for compensating children who've been impacted by the child welfare system, but over 20 billion of it is going to be for child welfare reform. So as a citizen, as an Indigenous person, I really look forward to seeing what that reform looks like. And to me, that is paying attention to one of those calls to action that are in the TRC report, is that the system needs to be looked at. It's netted the same results, which are terrible results over, over many, many years. Other areas that are touched on in the TRC report are areas around education, which Indigenous people are, poorly represented in those statistics. So poor completion rates. There's the biggest section in there is on justice. There's 18 calls to action of the 94 that are on justice. And so there's a real need to look at that system. One of the things I find is that we have kids, tremendous overrepresentation of Indigenous kids in the child welfare system. They end up graduating into that justice system. And so, those two systems alone, if you could pay huge attention to those two systems, you'll see an overall impact on the well-being of Indigenous people across the land. And then one of the things I wanted to touch on this morning is there are 6 calls to action on missing kids and burial sites. So we all were impacted across the land by the discovery of unmarked graves at various schools in the country. And there was a lot of shock across the country to this news. Our communities have known about this, and that is why it has its own section in the TRC report. So there's been an invitation from community leaders for people to look at that report. It's been out for a few years now, and there are real concrete steps that people can take. They're not all on the federal government. They're right down to actions that citizens can take. And so there's that. On the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls report, the recommendations there very closely align with the recommendations of the TRC, which to me is no surprise. The impacts of child welfare on our women and kids, looking at the root causes and education systems and paying attention to those, healthcare for Indigenous women, the impact, the huge protective factors that culture have on all people. is another step. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation really has provided, Canadians an opportunity to take that day to reflect on so many of these things that I'm talking about this morning. So there are steps that are being taken, but we as people, we need to take those steps. We can't rely on necessarily levels of government to do that for us. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well done summarizing 2 giant reports in 5 minutes. And I just want to touch on that self-determination piece with child welfare and Bill C-92. So important. I agree. It needs to be thought out. So maybe it's not going to happen overnight, but just so important. So I'm quite pleased with that's happening. Okay, I'm going to move it on to Sylvie. Let's talk about the Quebec's $8 a day daycare, the impact of that, because you were involved in the pilot sites before. So can you touch on the impact, and then what can we expect to see from a national $10 a day daycare program?
Tout d'abord, merci de l'invitation et merci à vous tous d'être venus nous entendre. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous parler en français parce que je vais vous parler avec mon cœur, puis c'est plus facile pour moi de le faire dans ma langue maternelle. Lors de nos conversations, nous avons entendu « les enfants sont pauvres parce que leurs parents sont pauvres ». Des intervenants nous ont dit « la pauvreté des enfants, c'est d'abord celle des familles ». Et parce que la pauvreté des enfants, c'est malheureusement souvent aussi celle des familles qu'ils vont porter plus tard et que ces précieuses minutes volées à leur enfance ne reviendront pas, alors que le poids des traumatismes, lui, va durer. On doit leur fournir des environnements favorables et le soutien dont ils ont besoin pour empêcher que la pauvreté les affecte de génération en génération. Cette première garderie où j'ai travaillé dans les années 70 est née d'un besoin du milieu et avait pour objectif premier le mieux-être des enfants. Je reviens là-dessus parce que c'est ce que je ne veux pas qu'on perde. On y accueillait des enfants en grande vulnérabilité, d'horizons variés qui poussaient dans des quartiers défavorisés, dont quelques enfants à besoins particuliers, des enfants en grande pauvreté, des enfants de la classe moyenne. Et en 1973, on avait accueilli aussi les enfants réfugiés qui arrivaient tout juste au Québec suite au coup d'État contre Salvador Allende au Chili. C'est un milieu de vie sécuritaire et stimulant où, au contact des autres, ils développaient des compétences leur permettant d'arriver à l'école mieux préparés. On travaillait en intersectorialité avec des intervenants sociaux et de la santé qui pouvaient intervenir tôt dans le devenir de ces enfants. C'était aussi un lieu où les parents brisaient l'isolement et développaient des liens de confiance, ce qui favorisait la référence vers différentes ressources qui les soutenaient dans leur rôle de parents. Suite aux pressions des groupes de femmes, il y a 25 ans, dans la foulée de la création du ministère de la Famille au Québec, le réseau des centres de petite enfance ont été mis sur pied avec une volonté politique et s'est développé progressivement pour offrir des places abordables et de qualité aux enfants de 0-5 ans, favorisant leur développement global et permettant aux parents d'intégrer le marché du travail. Puis en même temps, on avait installé les maternelles 5 ans à plein temps. Les bas tarifs, 5 $ au début, actuellement à 8,70 en service de garde subventionné, je le mentionne, et la qualité des services de garde à l'enfance ont exercé une grande influence sur la décision des mères de travailler. Le revenu des familles a augmenté. Je m'excuse, Angélie, parce que je ne veux pas oublier rien. Des familles monoparentales ont pu sortir de la pauvreté. À l'époque, beaucoup de mères monoparentales étaient sur l'aide sociale puis hésitaient à aller travailler parce qu'elles ne voulaient pas perdre les avantages qu'elles avaient au niveau des médicaments, au niveau du soutien, du logement et tout ça. Avec plus de continuité puis moins d'interruptions dans leur carrière, le revenu d'emploi des femmes est devenu plus important sur l'ensemble de leur vie active, pas juste à la période de petite enfance, leur procurant une meilleure sécurité économique et plus de pouvoir sur leur vie, même s'il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire au niveau des différences de revenus des hommes et des femmes. Le développement des enfants, les CPE ont eu un effet favorable sur leur bien-être à court et à long terme et sur leurs compétences cognitives et relationnelles, facteur de réussite scolaire. C'est reconnu par plusieurs travaux et recherches publiés dans des grandes revues scientifiques en médecine et en psychologie. Il reste cependant que la proportion d'enfants vulnérables et de milieux défavorisés qui y ont accès est moindre que celle des enfants de milieux économiques plus favorables. Alors, les places ont été prises par des enfants dont les parents travaillaient. On n'a pas rejoint autant d'enfants vulnérables qu'on aurait voulu, je pense. Le Québec compte maintenant parmi les nations où les femmes sont les plus présentes sur le marché du travail, selon l'économiste Pierre Fortin, qui dit qu'en 2021, le taux de participation des femmes au marché du travail au Québec atteignait 87 %. C'est 80 000 femmes de plus qu'il y a 25 ans, représentant selon lui un gain de 7 milliards sur le revenu intérieur brut du Québec. Les études montrent aussi que chaque dollar investi dans la petite enfance, l'ensemble de l'économie touche entre 1,50 $ et 2,80 $ en retour. Ce réseau de services de garde que plusieurs voyaient d'abord comme une énorme dépense représente en fait un investissement qui a contribué à la prospérité du Québec. Le réseau des centres de la petite enfance a permis aussi les échanges, le co-développement d'expertise, la formation, la recherche, l'innovation, le développement des programmes structurés, des outils. Les formules combinées, par exemple, de centres de la petite enfance et de pédiatrie sociale au Québec, ils font des merveilles auprès des enfants. Des milliers d'emplois ont aussi été créés pour le personnel qui travaille directement auprès des enfants. La pandémie a d'ailleurs mis en lumière le caractère essentiel de leur travail et l'importance de les reconnaître et de leur donner des conditions de travail et un salaire plus juste. De nombreuses études pourront mieux que moi vous parler des chiffres. Je laisse quelques liens qui vous permettront d'approfondir la question sur le chat. Vous allez pouvoir les voir. Mais le temps a passé aussi, puis on a maintenant besoin d'un solide coup de barre et d'une réforme qui est d'ailleurs déjà amorcée. Au fil des différents gouvernements qui se sont succédés, des visions divergentes, des compressions budgétaires, de l'arrêt du développement de places, de la bureaucratie. Bref, le développement des nouvelles places a glissé progressivement vers le privé, où les éducateurs moins formés ne retrouvent pas les mêmes conditions de travail et où on ne retrouve pas la même qualité. Le manque de place a aussi obligé des parents à se tourner vers des formules de garde non agréées, souvent moins sécuritaires, ou à renoncer à leur présence sur le marché du travail. De plus, le manque de reconnaissance des dernières années a fait fuir plusieurs éducateurs et éducatrices et on se retrouve maintenant avec une pénurie de personnel. On peut avoir des places, mais on n'a présentement pas tout le personnel pour les combler. Fait que, il y a un risque pour le bon développement des enfants. Vous savez qu'avec moins de surveillance, moins de soutien, moins d'outils, on ne le répétera jamais assez, ces années de petite enfance-là sont cruciales. Alors, on ne voudrait pas nuire aux enfants au lieu de les aider en les envoyant dans des services de garde mal développés. Moi, je rêve du jour où l'accès à des services de garde de haute qualité deviendra un droit pour les enfants, tout comme le droit à l'éducation, et assurera des services de haute qualité encore plus inclusifs avec un nombre suffisant de places et des modèles flexibles pour répondre aux réalités des parents. Ce que vous pouvez attendre des garderies nationales à 10 $ par jour, c'est sûr que le coût des services de garde, moi, j'ai été surprise quand j'ai commencé sur le conseil de réaliser combien ça coûtait ailleurs faire garder des enfants, alors qu'au Québec, c'est comme un acquis pour nous. Il va y avoir beaucoup de femmes qui vont vouloir retourner sur le marché du travail. Il va falloir faire attention pour garder les places aussi, pour en garder pour les enfants qui en ont vraiment le plus besoin et ceux qu'on ne voit pas souvent non plus, qui ne se présenteront pas nécessairement tout près. Puis je pense que si vous êtes capable de développer en même temps parce que le milieu d'un service de garde, ça permet souvent à des parents de créer des liens, de développer un lien de confiance et on peut travailler avec eux aussi, leur offrir des services, des groupes de discussion, puis ils peuvent s'impliquer dans le développement de leurs enfants à ce niveau-là. Il va falloir s'attarder aussi au recrutement et à la formation en continu et au soutien du personnel, leur offrir des bons salaires, des conditions de travail pour assurer la rétention et plus de stabilité. C'est important aussi de respecter les disparités régionales de façon à permettre l'accessibilité, la proximité des services, la flexibilité des horaires, l'ouverture à la capacité à accueillir des enfants à besoins particuliers. C'est un milieu de vie formidable, les centres de petite enfance, parce que les enfants s'ouvrent à la différence. Puis ça fait des adultes, je pense que c'est un moyen aussi de combattre le racisme, de combattre ces difficultés-là, parce qu'ils sont avec d'autres enfants qui connaissent déjà. Pourquoi c'est une stratégie des plus percutantes à l'heure actuelle, les services de garde? C'est des services essentiels pour assurer l'égalité des chances et l'intégration dans la société en facilitant l'accès des services de qualité qui garantissent la santé et la sécurité des enfants et favorisent leur développement de leur plein potentiel, permettant ainsi à leurs parents de jouer un rôle dans la relance économique et de jouir d'un meilleur revenu leur assurant une sécurité économique. Alors, j'espère que je n'ai pas trop lu, mais ce que je veux vous dire, c'est que moi, la différence, je l'ai vue. J'ai eu la chance de travailler en garderie avec des enfants. J'ai rencontré, je vais l'appeler Robert, un petit bonhomme que j'ai connu à 3 ans dans la garderie à Saint-Henri, qui avait d'énormes problèmes. Je l'ai revu 26 ans plus tard parce que je travaillais dans un organisme qui aidait les jeunes à intégrer le marché du travail. Quand on s'est parlé, il a réalisé que c'était moi qui avais travaillé avec lui. Je l'ai revu après ça 10 ans plus tard. C'est lui qui représentait son employeur dans un salon de l'emploi où je participais avec l'organisme pour lequel je travaillais. Puis c'est là qu'il m'a dit que c'est lui qui représentait maintenant son employeur pour embaucher des jeunes. Puis il y avait 2 enfants, tout allait bien dans sa vie. Fait que moi, j'ai pu voir la continuité du travail du communautaire qui se fait à partir des centres de la petite enfance jusqu'à plus tard. Puis j'ai eu cette grâce-là. Mais je peux vous dire que Robert, quand je l'ai connu, c'était un petit bonhomme qui avait besoin de beaucoup de soins. On lui a donné, puis il a réussi à faire ce qu'il voulait de sa vie. Alors, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Sylvie. What a great story. Yeah, the Quebec model, the proportion of women being able to enter the workforce is huge. I know in Alberta, in our conversations with early learning and care, we quite often reference the Quebec model as a story of success. It pays for itself, and hoping to expand it throughout Canada. So thank you so much for that. So I have a couple other questions for the council. The first one, can someone expand on the recommendations to set specific targets for marginalized populations and making equity a priority? And also, just on the topic of gathering better data, can someone just give us a high-level overview of the trends, what's working, what's not? With so much needed to happen urgently, is more data and goal setting really where we need to start?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I'll take those questions. So we had some specific, a lot of conversation that we had last year really rested in the fact that inequity was an enabler of poverty. And it was really, poverty was discriminatory, it was sexist, it was ableist, it was racist. So a lot of the poverty is enabled by these kind of societal discrimination. So we had heard often that poverty is sometimes seen from the outside as a character flaw. But what we really figured out was poverty was an individual experience of a systemic inequity. Coming off of that idea, we made kind of 3 big recommendations in the equity area. So population-based surveys should ask inclusive questions and provide inclusive response options to allow for routine disaggregation of data to support better decision-making and reporting of disparities. Really focus on the furthest behind first. The low-hanging fruit, they've all been picked, but the people that are the furthest behind need the most support. So to commit and to specifically commit to reducing poverty by 50% by 2030 for marginalized populations, including Black populations, 2S LGBTQ people, Indigenous people, and persons with disability. And then as we go forward to specifically name and focus on these populations within existing and new strategies, initiatives, and supports. This is important because without the data, decisions get made in a vacuum, assuming that poverty in Canada has gone down over the past, since 2015, poverty in Canada has fell from 14.5% to 10.1%. But poverty for persons with disability under 65 is still 19%. For Indigenous persons off reserve is 18%. For racialized individuals overall, it's 20.6%. It's not available at all for persons, for First Nations on reserve, for 2S LGBTQ people. And then for some racialized populations like West Asian, so the Greater Middle East, it's 33%, which is more than 3 times the Canadian average. For Black individuals, it's 23%, so twice the Canadian average. So there's a lot of disparity, and without these further disaggregated surveys, we're not going to get to the appropriate responses. And so it's important that we start with data, but it's also important we don't end with data. So we end with action. I think that the starting with data and moving to action is really important. So we're doing that, and the council set out like day one that we were here for impact. We're here for a short time and not a good time we're here for impact. So I think we really hammer that home with the report. We think that the things we've put in place are aimed at a national level for the federal government, but they're applicable all the way down. So I think that they have application at the provincial and territorial government level, municipal government, institutions, local institutions, communities, and even on the individual level. So if we start living these principles, then we won't be talking about 1 in 10 people living in poverty in Canada, because 1 in 10 people live in poverty, but 10 out of 10 people live with poverty. And we have to figure that poverty is not something that belongs to the 1, but it belongs to the 10, and we have to figure out what we can do about it.
That was a great explanation. Thank you so much, Scott. And I know when we were chatting about this, when you look at who's living in poverty, you were like, it's a map of racism and other isms. And that really is something that we don't talk about enough. But I think in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of attention on it. I think that's good because it's something that we need to address. So I appreciate that. I'm going to move on to a topic that we've also talked about, but I think for the benefit of everyone here, some people want to know, what about basic income? There's so much momentum for basic income with the CERB. It's such a well-researched concept with the Ontario pilot. And then we have the MIncome in the 1970s. So why wasn't basic income a recommendation? Can you talk a little bit about some of your conversations about your position on basic income and maybe expand on that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So as a council, we never really took a position on basic income. I think basic income as a concept is interesting. What we decided to do was as a council, we wanted to make sure that everybody living in Canada there was an income floor we established. So one of our recommendations that we reiterated 2 years in a row was that to collaborate with provinces and the federal government to provide income that is at least at the level of Canada's official poverty line, so that everybody in Canada has at least that amount when you coordinate the programs and benefits. I think there's recommendations. There's many forms of the basic income, and we've talked about the guaranteed annual income, the provision of a guaranteed income, and we as we said, there's probably already a basic income for seniors and children. There's a mix in between. There's none for working age singles. There's very little for working age singles, actually, and I think that's one of the areas that we need to put some thought into as a country. How are we going to do that better? And we also, and then this year, so not to ruin any surprises from the next report, but we've heard a lot that a job and education aren't pathways. So employment and education aren't direct pathways out of poverty anymore. They may have been at one point, but they're not anymore. So what are we going to do about that? And we haven't considered that yet, but we're working on it. So I like the basic income talk, and I think it's moving in the right direction. And there's other groups that are working on it, and I think the council's been really conscientious not to step on toes. So there's a National Food Policy Council, there's a National Housing Council, there's a National Seniors Council, and there's a lot of big groups working on basic income. So I think we often defer to the experts, and this is maybe one of those cases. Maybe Cheryl or Sylvie has another comment.
Thank you, Scott. It's Sylvie or Cheryl. Do any of you want to jump in here? Nope. No problem. Don't blame you. And okay, second last question before we move into Q&A. So most of these are federal recommendations, but what can community do? What can people in municipalities and non-for-profit, civil society, what are some actions that they can take?
I can answer, but I can also defer to I think Cheryl would be great at this. She works in community all the time.
Yeah,
sure. So, I'm co-chairing End Poverty Edmonton here in Edmonton, and Edmonton is kind of a neat place, very sort of community minded. No matter how big we seem to get, we consider ourselves to be one here. And so Lately, our work has come to include and invite industry and like large corporations to the table to talk about what are some of the things that they're seeing. So we know we have people who need jobs. We know we have people who need jobs with a livable income, for example. And these big companies will say, well, we have jobs, but nobody's applying. And so folks that you're trying to get jobs for aren't applying for the jobs that we have. So we do a deeper dive into like, why aren't they applying? And we find out simple things like, just as a real example that happened here, that there was an Indigenous person who applied, and he tried to stay on this crew, but he wasn't included as part of the crew for all kinds of reasons. And eventually he got tired of eating lunch alone and, trying to be a part of this group that didn't know how to include him in. And so the solution became hire a crew of Indigenous people. And so they will be their own crew. And the ability to retain those folks in those jobs just goes up, instantly. So it's just really about having those conversations with people who are doing this work in the community. Another example goes back to this act about respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis children, youth, and families. I'm hearing from my colleagues here in Edmonton, like, how can we help this act, gain some traction? What can we be doing with our families that's different? And we talked about very simply, looking at our intake forms. And how are we identifying ways that these children can be identified from day one? Because once you're identified as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, the act applies to you regardless of your status with the government. And so those tenets of that act then apply to those children. And they're not, you may look into this. It's like, you must pay attention to this. And that will change the sort of ways children are navigating their way through that system. And then we'll see the results of that, 15, 20, 25, 30 years down the road, how we're working with these children now. So that's some of the ways that we're doing things here in Edmonton.
Thanks, Cheryl. The power of grassroots. Yeah, we're doing some stuff in Calgary too. And Sylvie, did you want to jump in at all?
Je pense qu'on est tous responsables, dans le fond. On est tous responsables d'aider les gens à sortir de la pauvreté et à être une société plus égalitaire et plus inclusive. Je pense que les municipalités ont beaucoup à faire au niveau des environnements favorables, permettre aux gens de faire de l'exercice, de faire du sport, de marcher, de faire des choses, mais avec des coûts qui n'existent pas. Ça peut être possible de le faire pour que ce soit plus facile pour les gens. Amener aussi au niveau de l'alimentation des choses plus près. Chaque personne aussi est responsable. Moi, je me souviens qu'en travaillant au Carrefour Jeunesse Emploi, j'ai eu souvent les clients, les jeunes qui venaient nous rencontrer, c'était des amis qui les amenaient. Des fois, c'était un voisin qui avait entendu parler du service, puis qui voyait qu'il était en difficulté, qui venait le reconduire aussi, puis qui l'aidait, qui le soutenait dans ces choses. Fait que je pense que tout le monde a une responsabilité pour aider les personnes, pour aider notre société à devenir plus égalitaire. Et les personnes aussi qui sont en difficulté, qui trouvent du soutien, ont la responsabilité de partager ces trucs-là avec d'autres pour être capable d'aller un petit peu plus loin aussi. Ça fait qu'on est tous responsables de faire une meilleure société.
Thank you, Sylvie. And for the individual organizations, join a coalition. I'm just going to throw that out there. There's strength in numbers. Okay, so last question, what is the next steps for the council?
Thanks, Lee. So the next steps are happening right now. We've launched into with our mandate. Back up a little bit, the council is made up of 10 people across the country, coast to coast to coast. Our mandate is to provide independent advice to the Minister of Family, Communities, Families, Children and Social Development, to report annually on the progress towards the 2030 goal of a 50% reduction in poverty in Canada, and to continue a conversation with Canadians about poverty. So this year, our conversation with Canadians about poverty has taken the form of 7 cross-country, cross-cutting conversations. So we've had 3 to date. We invited about 6,000 people. We've had 300 plus registrations for each of the sessions. we have about 190 show up of the 300. So I'm not sure if that's a good drop-off rate, but we're pleased. And so we've engaged them in really some deep conversation about where poverty is now, where it's going, what can we do differently, and really with a future focus. So how do we look at so far we've done things about the poverty trap, things that get people stuck in poverty, or allow people to get into poverty. We've done sessions on grassroots things, but that cut across a lot of different areas. So it's not about this. Last year was about food, and then transportation, and then housing and homelessness, and then health. This year it's about kind of all those things together. So how do we take on these big hairy problems as a country, as a society, from all points of view, and come up with a solution that will work for everyone? So that's the first phase. We have 7 conversations. They go to the end of February, and then in March we're going to dig into them a bit more. So whatever the top things that are coming up and keep reoccurring across conversations, we'll dig into those with the numbers, the data, see what that tells us, and see where we need to engage with persons with lived expertise, so they can share their experience with us, and we can see how these proposed interventions would work. So using almost like a design model to say, okay, here's a prototype. What do you think of that? And really putting the people that are going to live the experience at the center of the implementation and development of the service and product or policy. Then we get together. It takes a long time for the production on a national report. So then we hope to release it right around October 17th, 2022. And then hopefully we'll have another one of these Tamarack webinars shortly after to allow the 286 people across the country and across the planet to ask us some great questions.
Wow, that's quite the process. Anyone else want to jump in before we go into Q&A?
I'll just add that we've enjoyed some really good access to the minister of the day. So I think we're on our 3rd minister for this appointment, and so being able to spend time with those ministers is really important, and also the ability to share, their ability to take our message to the many tables that they sit at. We got invited, I think it was 2 years ago, to a special event at the United Nations. And so Scott and I got to present there. So yeah, that's been an exciting part of this journey as well.
Cool. Thanks, Cheryl. Okay, I'm going to move it into this Q&A because Sylvie, yes, please go.
Juste quelques mots pour dire que moi, j'aimerais beaucoup qu'on entende plus les enfants et les jeunes aussi cette année. Alors, je vais mettre de l'accent, de l'intérêt là-dessus.
Great point. Okay, I'm going to move it on to a question. One of the first questions we have is quite long. It's about the challenges in workforce development. And this is related to the future of work session, I think, that we had, but I'm just going to quote the second part of her question. It's related also to what Cheryl said. And she just talks about investing and connecting folks to the same ecosystem together, the workforce ecosystem. Positive change can happen. Employers employ folks in marginalized circumstances, social services agencies support people to get and keep those jobs. And the community is given accurate and timely information to start on the journey to local employment. So there are some positive change that are happening in some communities, but what are your thoughts on addressing our workforce challenges when it comes to poverty reduction?
Yeah, I think they're huge. I think that's part of the, we had talked about basic income earlier. I think living wage and work of value and being paid for that value is a big piece of it. Community economic development definitely has a role. I saw there's a question in the chat about that work isn't a guaranteed pathway to poverty. It can be a pathway to poverty, but only if it's paid a living wage. So if you're able to work one job or many jobs that cobble into one job, and then that job lets you live out of poverty, then it can move you to poverty. but often people are working a lot for a little and not really getting ahead. The marginal effective tax rate puts you down. There's a lot of clawbacks in the systems that put you down. So I think that the idea of partnering industry with workforce, skilling people up, paying them for what they're worth, and then and sharing the profits and sharing the benefits is important. I know Vancouver's doing some awesome work with community economic developments, and they have those small markets that are pop-up markets, and that's a really interesting way of really stimulating a local economy. But there's big ways like community economic benefit agreements or community benefit agreements, and I think those are an important way that municipalities and other groups can really play into this idea that everybody has a part to play and everyone has a contribution to make to their own place and their own and to make it theirs and to feel like it's home.
Yeah, that's related to social procurement too. You know,
yeah,
you're not asking governments to spend more money. It's just spend the money you're already spending smarter, invest in community, and invest in marginalized people as well. So I think that's a really neat concept as well. Okay, we have a question about a major problem with evidence-based managed is the lack of skills to design collection instruments. I don't know if she's talking about assessments here. A problem with interpreting data collected and understanding its meaning for policy development and program delivery. Have you had experience with creating capacity for managing these results?
Cheryl,
Sylvie?
So problem,
no, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Interpreting the data. I think it's the capacity of people or organizations to interpret the data. And maybe that's because we've had a lot of mixed trends in 2021. Like the income data shows that poverty has decreased, but we know many other trends are going in the opposite direction. So it could be related to that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think that the data comes in, and the data we use is from the Canada Income Survey. So StatsCan does all our data crunching for us. But I think that a lot of the products that they produce are probably the most useful to a lot of community members that don't have a background in data disaggregation and how to get down to what they're trying to find. So I think a lot of those asking better questions is what I think data can lead you to. But I think you're right, and people can make bad assumptions on good data still. But so I think really putting the data into a life into the community and seeing what it actually means. But you're right, food security, housing, they're going in one direction and poverty is going in the other direction. But they seem to have had historically a connection between them and be related, but this year doesn't make much sense, really.
The other thing I heard in many of the engagements last year was that communities are collecting data. And so they have a story to tell from the data that they're collecting, but on a national scale, like Scott's saying, it's not available. Those questions aren't asked. And so there is recommendations that we start targeting like certain things to get a bit more information on these areas where there isn't, poverty is going down, but for certain people it's not, right? And so that's what the data has told us. So how do we ask those questions so that we can get into the why, so that we can get into the how? But the communities we spoke to are saying we have all kinds of data, and that's why we're able to say this is what's happening in our community. But on a national scale, that's where we need to catch up.
Yeah, it's also hard to aggregate the data down to the community level when StatsCan, the dashboard's great, but it just shows you all of Canada. So when you're trying to figure out what poverty looks like in your community, it is really difficult. So yeah, you do have to rely on those smaller parties collecting their own data and using that to get a picture of poverty in your own city or community. So that's a good point. There's a question about inflation rates. So how is inflation rates affecting our poverty reduction goals for 2030?
So with influence, I don't mean to start a sentence with so. Inflation rates definitely will impact in two ways. So the market basket measure is adjusted for inflation. so that the poverty rate will take that into account. But I think that, so I'm not sure if the rate will be really that much impacted, but what I do think will be impacted is the cost of goods. And then, so if we're looking at a basket's going to be more expensive and your dollar's going to be worth less. So I think that should, indicate a higher poverty rate, but I think it's a few years out. With the way that we're measuring, CIS is a 2-year lag, so data isn't immediate. I think that there'll be a lot of anecdotal talk of poverty increases before the actual numbers back up that assertion. But yeah, inflation is really good for anybody, except a lot of businesses are allowed to say, well, we have to charge more because of COVID, and then they do, and then they have record profits. So I'm not sure that's fair either. But as an aside,
maybe to add to that, a lot of government benefits are not indexed to inflation.
Right.
So that recommendation was really important in the report. We want to bring income support rates up to the poverty line, but we also want to index them. Rental subsidies, government subsidies, we have to index these to inflation.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of groups are saying.
Marking that down. Thanks, Lee.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question about basic income and using, what we learned from the CERB. Understanding UBI in some form is an obvious solution. How can we get past all the economic complexities and just get this section of our social welfare to adjust to the times?
We have a conversation on the social safety net next week. So I think TBD is the answer to that. So to be determined. But I mean, and Lee and I had talked about Bill C-73. Is that right?
Yeah, C-273. That was the first basic income bill. Yeah.
Right. So we had talked about that and how it just finished with the election call. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's some interesting conversations to have around basic income, and I think that willingness to engage in that conversation is important from both sides. I think that there is a part of our population that thinks that free money is free money, and if they work for their money, then people shouldn't get it for free, and that there's a kind of inherently a false kind of narrative about people being lazy and not wanting to work, and that came out in the CERB benefit a lot, and I heard it in the CERB. It was really I struck me as odd because people were putting themselves in harm's way to make enough money because they didn't qualify for the CERB, and putting themselves and their families in danger, like literally, like it could be a life or death decision to go to work, and that often fell on some of those groups that have been made marginal, or the equity deserving groups, to keep the Amazons flowing or keep the shopping centers full of food. When a lot of other people were able to sit at home and call those people that are going out or not going out because they're choosing their family's health over an income, lazy. So I think that there's a deeper conversation in Canada that has to happen, and it's around the value of supporting everybody, and everyone having a role in our society. I think that's a bigger conversation. But I agree that basic income or guaranteed annual income or a income floor definitely has a role in it. We just have to figure out what that is.
Yeah, it's also a debate about values as much as it is about evidence. So yeah, thank you. Another question here. What can we do at the local level, the neighborhood level, to reduce or end poverty? What are your proposals to link the poverty work done locally to what is done at the national scale? So maybe how are we connecting?
Yeah, I feel like I've been talking too much. That's my I throw it to anybody else, but I have an idea too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many ways. You know, I spoke of them, I think, the last time I answered a question, which is really to educate yourself on these things. Like we've spent time this morning talking, and we're preaching to the choir here. You know, everyone who's in this webinar, but to promote conversations around basic income and what are they about, and learn about what it means, so that, you know, if it does become an election issue or something that you want to talk to your MP about, you have some knowledge about what that means, and do you support it or not. You know, I talked about the TRC calls to action. There's so much in there that you can educate yourself about, and start looking at the news with different eyes and awareness. As an employer, you know, learning about living wage, like there is a program here in Alberta that talks about living wage, and there's like a program you can jump into and see if you're paying a living wage, and if you are, you get like a sticker you can put on your door that says we pay a living wage here. So as a consumer, you go in knowing that you're supporting a company that is paying living wages to their employees. Like there's so many groundswell movements that are happening, yeah. So anyway, I just think there's so many things people can do. I think you get into a bit of a box when you do this work for a living, that you don't see all these other things that are happening out there that you could be having some impact on.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Sylvie, you wanted to jump in.
Ben, je vais intervenir au niveau des communautés. Moi, je sais que dans plusieurs communautés au Québec, il y a des politiques de développement social qui sont mises sur pied. Elles sont mises sur pied avec la participation de personnes, d'organismes communautaires, mais aussi d'entreprises, d'institutions, de citoyens qui décident ensemble des orientations de leur communauté pour voir sur quoi ils veulent porter une attention, où sont les manques, où sont les besoins pour des personnes, comment on peut aider les gens justement à mieux vivre. Je pense que c'est une porte d'accès importante aussi de se réunir en petite communauté pour décider c'est quoi les impacts qu'on veut provoquer. Mais toutes personnes confondues, là, autant les organisations que les organismes, les institutions, les entreprises, même nous, en tout cas, à Vaudreuil-Soulanges, on l'a fait. Puis j'ai trouvé ça vraiment, ça a été vraiment aidant.
Yeah, I think, Lee, that that values thing you brought up is really important, because we need to figure out as a country how to reconnect with our shared humanity. There's a lot of division that's sown by a lot of fear and distrust, but we need to connect. We need to talk. We need to have this open discourse without jumping to judgment. We need to be curious. There is no room for racism or for any of the hate, but there's a lot of room for the love. So we need to figure out how to get back to that. How do we take care of and care for each other and take care of each other? These seem like you know, big kind of fluffy pink glasses kind of stuff, but that's at the heart of it. Like if we actually care about our neighbors, and everybody does that, then our country's in a much better place than it is right now.
Yeah. I just want to add to that, Scott. Thanks for that. One of the things I made a commitment to do last summer when those unmarked graves were found was to engage with as many people as I could. There was a willingness to talk, a willingness to explore, a willingness to learn. And it was such a hard thing to talk about. I made a commitment, as hard as it was going to be, to engage with people who wanted to engage. I remember a woman, and I don't remember her name, but she said, I cannot imagine being the mother. I have a 5-year-old. I cannot imagine my child going through this. And I said, well, I think you can. You know, imagine if that happened. You know, you would probably become severely depressed and have a hard time getting out of your bed, which means you probably won't make it to work, right? Which means, and your marriage will probably suffer because, you know, you're just not engaged with the world because you're in such deep grief. Maybe you'll resort to using substances to self-medicate, right? Then child welfare comes and they come and take, you know, like they'll take your 5-year-old away because you're not taking care of him, right? And it makes you deeper depressed. And so I said, oh, wait, that's what's happening today. Like this is the intergenerational effects of that Indigenous people are going through right now. This is what's happening. And so trying to connect for that mom who has a 5-year-old and trying to imagine if someone took her 5-year-old from her, how it would impact her. And I tried to paint a picture for her that this is what Indigenous people are still experiencing today. And it's this intergenerational cycle that they're going through of their kids repeatedly being taken away. And a lot of them are from issues of poverty, right? And then people get paid to take care of those children. And so it's a national conversation, like Scott said, and it's really hard things to talk about. But there was a willingness for people to have those discussions, and we have to have them. So as hard as they are,
and find common ground and have empathy and the importance of depolarizing our climate right now. Sylvie, you want to jump in?
Moi, je veux juste revenir que pour moi, tout commence avec les enfants. Si les enfants profitent d'un environnement qui leur permet de se développer en santé, de développer leur plein potentiel, s'ils développent leur ouverture aux autres, leur bienveillance, la tolérance, l'inclusion, la résilience, moi, j'ai espoir qu'un monde plus juste va arriver. Mais il faut vraiment travailler avec eux autres. Puis on a une belle opportunité de le faire en faisant avec leurs parents, à travers justement les services de garde ou à travers des différents services pour la petite enfance. On peut commencer là. Puis je pense qu'il faut commencer par le début. Puis on peut les aider là.
Thank you so much. I might turn it over to Natasha to see, do we have time for one last question or no?
I would say if there's a really quick question there.
I do have a question about unpaid care work. I think someone wants to know the council's thoughts on recognizing, especially the caregiving work that women have done for free.
I've heard about that in some of my engagements and how little consideration is given to it and how little value is placed on it. I heard in one engagement about parents of a disabled child who turned into an adult and how it impacted their ability to go out and earn a living because they were caring for this, you know, their child who was an adult who needed that kind of care. And they're invisible. There's just an expectation that happen, or they become a part of a system where they're not going to receive that same level of care that a family member would give. And so it's a real issue. And people from those circumstances feel very unheard and invisible.
Yeah, and we've linked the idea of formal care is someone that gets paid to care about somebody else or care for. And then it's informal care when it's actual care. So I think that the actual vernacular around it could evolve into where that we have care and paid care. And I think that might change the water on the beans a little bit, as they say on the East Coast.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you everybody so much for this discussion. For everybody who's in the chat box offering comments, questions, there were a few links in the box as well. And for all of our speakers today, Lee for taking us through this conversation, Sylvie, Scott, and Cheryl. I have just a couple of closing announcements for everyone. If you enjoyed this webinar, you might also be interested in continuing this idea about systems change and thinking like a system. So on March 2nd from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, we are going to have a webinar with Margaret Wheatley and the City of Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps. They're having a fireside chat to discuss the type of systems thinking leaders we need for cities and towns to repair the social fabric in our communities amidst this kind of growing distrust in democracy and leadership. And they're going to look at questions like, how can we all be change leaders? So you'll get that link to register in the follow-up email. You might also be interested in the workshop building a community-based COVID renewal plan. This is going to be with Tamarack directors Lisa Adagala and Paul Borm to discuss strategies, mindsets, and a key framework needed to respond to complex situations that communities can employ. So that is all. You will get all of the links that were shared around today in the follow-up email, as well as a recording of both the English and the French version of this webinar. It was a pleasure talking with everyone today. We hope we'll see you back soon. Thank you once again to our panelists and to everyone in the chat box. Have a wonderful afternoon.